Would you ask Dr. Rochefort to come back in, please? Thank you.
Good afternoon.
All right, Dr. Rochefort?
Yes, that's
You
right.
ready to carry on? Yes, thank you. Yes, Ms. Green.
Yes, thank you. Yes, we were in an email chain relating to the concerns that have been raised by Kingspan offsite. If we can go back to that, KIN 403714. And if we can look closely at that email you sent at the top of that page there. Now, I'd asked you about that first paragraph, but I now want to just look at the second paragraph. You say, if necessary, I suppose we could send old formulation material for the testing if you think this has a better chance and they are pressing, but this is undesirable for several reasons, and I'd rather delay and get the new FR product made as soon as Hexion can supply material, which we are waiting on. Do you see that there?
Yes, I do.
What were the reasons which would make it undesirable to send old formulation foam to Kingspan offsite for their testing?
I think I covered them earlier. It's several reasons. I mean, originally, Gwyn Davis had queried, I think, the performance of the old material. So it wasn't certain it would work in this system. Changing over to the old material would mean the whole production line would have to, well, the whole production line for K15 at least would have to change over. And therefore, unless Ivor was saying that was definitely the route to go, I would rather delay for this particular fire test sequence, get the new FR product.
Yes. And was one of those reasons also that it was not the product Kingspan were in fact manufacturing and selling at the time? I think that follows from what you've just said about you'd have to transfer over at least the whole K15 process to the old tech. That would be extremely burdensome, wouldn't it, and costly?
It would be logistically just quite difficult to do, but it would be possible. I mean, if Ivor was saying, yes, that's the way, then we could have done it.
Can we agree that you're not in this email saying to your colleagues, I'm really concerned that we're selling something that hasn't passed these tests?
I'm not saying that, but again, it's a system being tested, so I still don't know if it's the system that's giving the problem or the product.
So far as you are aware, after this, did anyone ever tell Kingspan offsite anything about the fact that the K15 they had been testing was a different K15 from the one with which Kingspan had some success?
I don't know. I know there were meetings with offsite, I think, with Aidan Wilkinson after this, but I don't think I was involved in them.
No. You said in your witness statement, and we looked at it earlier this morning, that in your experience, Kingspan always gave straight and clear advice from which you consider Kingspan was respected within the industry. Did you think it was giving straight and clear advice to recommend that you said that it was potentially the problems were in the same batch and might suffer from a similar problem back to Kingspan offsite?
I think this was in terms of internally coming up with a reason to pause and say, well, what's up with the fire test, with this particular fire test, and that was probably the best way to do it at that time. But as I say, there were separate discussions with offsite, so I don't know what was discussed.
I see. Can we agree that the only tests that you could rely on at this stage, even remotely, to support Kingspan being used over 18 metres was the 2005 test that had been done on old technology?
It was the 2005 test that we were relying on, yes.
I just want to put some passages to you from Mr. Meredith's oral evidence that he gave to this inquiry, and to get your response to those. If we can go first to day 75, page 179. And if we can pick it up at line 14, and this is where we'd been discussing the Kingspan offsite emails. So I say at 14, just putting this email to one side for the moment and just thinking generally, did Mr. Rochefort ever raise any concerns with you about supplying customers with new technology K15 given the fire risk it posed? And then he says this, I don't think, as far as I recollect, Malcolm didn't raise issues with me. It would be me raising issues with him. I would always go to him with my problems, not vice versa. So I can't recollect, unfortunately. Do you see that there?
I see his response, yes.
And do you agree with that, that it was him raising issues with you and problems about K15 with you, rather than you ever going to him and saying, if we've got problems with K15, what should we do about it? Do you agree?
No, I don't agree. I think clearly you could see that I'm saying that, look, to either, if the old process is the product you think we need to supply for this, then let's do it. So,
well, we've talked about that email, and
but that is talking to either. I would have said the same in person as well. So
yes, and we've discussed whether or not that email might actually be read as you providing old process K15 for the testing to Kingspan offsite. Yes.
No, we wouldn't have done that. It would have been
right. Can we look at day 75, page 157 now, and pick it up at line 8. So this was earlier in his questioning when we've been discussing his report about how the phenolic burned. And if you pick it up at line 8, I say, did Philip Heath and Malcolm Rochefort share your concern about the fire performance of the new technology K15 at this time? And he says, like I say, I think this might have been the time that I was criticised for not being very positive about our products, or sorry, the Kingspan products. Do you see that there?
yes.
Were you ever made aware that Mr. Meredith was criticised for not being positive enough about Kingspan products?
No, I wasn't aware of that.
And that didn't come ever from you as technical director?
No, I wouldn't. I appreciated the openness of Ivor. I mean, he wasn't the most stable of characters, but he was very dedicated. He did an excellent job on the whole, and I very much appreciated it.
And then it carries on. So I put the question at 14. So does it follow that you didn't think your managers were concerned or were concerned in the same way as you? And then he says, I don't think they were concerned in the same way as me. No. And then I say yes. And then he said, I felt a tremendous responsibility for this because the buck stopped with the technical department to make sure that it was suitable for the marketplace, and we had to do the testing. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Would you agree that you weren't concerned in the same way that he was about the fire performance of K15?
I think we were concerned about the results from the fire tests, from the system tests, and I think we were looking at K15 as one of the possible causes of that problem.
Right.
So I think I have to look at it in an objective way.
And if we carry on at 24, line 24, I ask, after you wrote this, and obviously this report was delivered to the technical team, did you feel at the time that your concerns about the fire performance of new technology K15 were being taken seriously by Philip Heath and Malcolm Rochefort? And he says this, answer, I felt like I wasn't ever heard, actually, when it came to issues like this. And then at line 6, did you actually have conversations with them, as well as writing this, in which you said, I'm really concerned about how K15 performs, given the testing we've just done, how it performs in fire? Did you have those conversations with them? There was always a new solution on the horizon. We could try this, or we could do this. So I was constantly being, there was something round the corner that could help us move forward. So I guess I was always hoping that would be the end of it, really. Do you see that there?
I see that, yeah.
Now, just going back to that earlier part at line 4, he says he felt he wasn't ever heard when it came to issues like this. Are you prepared to accept, looking at it now, that you didn't hear him properly about the concerns he was expressing?
No, I think we did hear. I think it was one of the factors we had to take into account.
And is it right that in reality, everyone was always just looking to the new solution on the horizon, the next possible test that might validate the use of K15 on tall buildings? Is that the reality of how it was at the time?
I don't know if that was a general issue. I think my propensity, because of my job, was I'm a chemist, was to look for possible chemical solutions. That would be the sort of thing I would do. So that would be the way my mind would work.
But as technical director, was it not part of your responsibility to make sure that you weren't selling something which was being misdescribed from a technical point of view? Was that not part of your responsibility, not just to look for the next solution, but to check that what you were selling was safe?
I think we had in general, in terms of the fire testing, etc., carried out tests. I think this particular system test was raising concerns, and we were looking at it and saying, well, how can we solve this issue?
I see. And then if we carry on, it's line 17, but do you actually have a specific recollection of raising concerns with them? He says, answer, I raised concerns on numerous occasions when it came to new technology. And then about its fire performance, yeah. But you didn't think you were listened to, is that what you're saying? I might have been listened to, but they certainly didn't respond to it. Do you see that there?
Mm.
And then I go on. You said earlier that you thought it was around this time that you were being criticised for being too negative. Who was it who criticised you for being too negative? It would have been the managing director. So who was that? Malcolm. And he says, Peter Wilson. Okay. Now, were you ever made aware that Peter Wilson was criticising Ivor Meredith for being too negative about K15's fire performance?
No, I wasn't.
Mr. Heath also said in his evidence yesterday that Mr. Meredith's concerns were conveyed to you. We can see that in writing.
Yes.
But I asked him that, and he confirmed that they were conveyed to you. Can you explain why you didn't take those concerns seriously at the time?
Sorry, I think we did take them seriously. I think we were doing a lot of work to see if we could solve those problems.
Did you ever take steps to check that in fact you were only ever selling K15 on high-rise buildings for those with masonry substrates? Did you ever check that for yourself?
I don't think I did. I would have relied on the sales and TS to make sure that happened.
Why not? Once you realise that K15's performed so badly in steel-framed systems, that's your evidence, that it was the system that was so concerning, why not check that what you're selling is only ever for masonry substrates?
I would have trusted the system and the people involved in it.
I see. I want to go on now to ask you about the LABC System Approval Certificate that was issued in 2009. And you make clear, just for the transcript, it's paragraph 8.4 of your statement, page 36, that you had no direct involvement in any interaction with the LABC in 2009 in relation to that certificate. That's right, isn't it?
That's correct, yes.
And who was responsible, so far as you were aware, for obtaining that document, that LABC system certification?
As far as I know, it was Philip Heath.
When did you first see the final issued document? It was issued in May 2009. Did you see it straight away? Do you remember?
I don't know that I actually saw the document. I mean, I presumably at some stage I would have looked at it, but I don't recall looking through the document.
What did you understand to be the purpose of Kingspan obtaining this LABC certificate?
I understood the purpose was as a way of ensuring that K15 could be used on facades above 18 metres.
Yes, yeah. And generally on facades over 18 metres. That's right, isn't it? Not just on masonry systems.
I don't think it says that. I mean, I've looked at it subsequently. I don't think it says that, does it?
Don't think it says what?
that it can generally be used on. I think it's all in terms of non-combustible.
Well, let's look at an email that you're sent about this. KIN 3020714. And I want to go to the first email in the chain, 3 emails down on page 1. It's an email from Mr. Heath. And you are CC'd into it. Do you see that at the top of the page?
Yes.
7th of May 2009. And he says this: great news. Please find attached local authority building control approval for K15 rain screen board. And he says, what is LABC approval? Under agreement by all local authorities in England and Wales, design approvals for building types and building systems can be issued by one local authority and accepted by all other local authorities, providing there are no changes in design, implementation, construction or site-specific variables. This approval covers compliance with the building regulations. A register of approval designs is kept by LABC, etc. And then benefits, he says, having a building type, housing, commercial or industrial, or a complete building element, a system approved by LABC, means that it can be used without the full plans approval process happening repetitively around the country at each site. This saves time and money for developers, designers, engineers, contractors and builders. And then he says this: the highlight of this certificate and supporting documentation is the requirement under B4 of ADB, external fire spread. Since K15 can be considered a material of limited combustibility, it is suitable in all situations shown on diagram 40 of approved document B, volume 2, including those parts of a building more than 18 metres above ground. In the latter circumstances, the cladding system and the substrate to which the insulation is applied must also meet the requirements for limited combustibility. Where the substrate is a metal-framed wall system rather than masonry or concrete, non-combustible lining board must be specified to the external face of the metal-framed wall, e.g. calcium silicate board or similar performing. And then he says, note, this statement does not differ from anything that Kingspan states. And then he goes on, if we can go to the next part. K15 remains the only insulation board that successfully met the requirements of the BBA and LABC system approval. All the relevant documents surrounding the approval certificate are attached. Special thanks to Andrew Pack for his consistent endeavours. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Now, going back to the answer you gave earlier, and if we just look at the extract he's put, if we go back a page into there, it is saying that you can use K15 on all situations shown on diagram 40. It then says the cladding system and the substrate to which the insulation is applied must also meet the requirement for limited combustibility. And where the substrate is a metal-framed wall system rather than masonry, non-combustible lining board must be specified. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Now, what test evidence did you have that you were aware of that supported that text in that certificate?
I wasn't aware of what test there was. I think I asked Philip what he'd done to get the approval.
Yes, we'll look at that in a minute. Looking at it now, what test evidence could there have been to support the use of K15 in a metal-framed wall system, provided you use a non-combustible lining board? Where's that test evidence? I
don't know. I mean, I would have looked at this and I wouldn't have understood it. Probably in the way that I understand it now, I wouldn't have understood it then. So I think that would have passed me by. I'd have just said, well, that makes sense. If it's a non-combustible lining board is internal instead of a masonry or concrete wall, that would have made sense to me at the time.
What, even though you had no test evidence to support that?
I wasn't that aware of what the in terms of what the steel frame test was, in the sense that I wouldn't have been aware what was on the inside.
But we've looked at documents that show that you were fully aware in 2007 and 2008 that there were tests to 8414 Part 2, the steel frame structure, and you've been at pains to emphasise that you recognise that was those were failures in that particular system.
In those systems, yes.
In the light of that, how could you be satisfied that it was appropriate to say that you can use K15 in a metal-framed wall system when you knew that system that's being described there had not been tested and certainly hadn't passed?
I didn't know that described what was actually tested, and I still don't know actually if that described what was tested, because it does say non-combustible lining board must be specified to the external face of the metal frame wall. So I assumed that this was a requirement that LABC had put in or were happy with, that enabled that type of construction.
Would you agree that clearly this certificate was a cause for celebration within Kingspan?
Well, yes, Philip Heath says great news, exclamation mark. So.
And looking at the part that's in bold, material of limited combustibility, what did you understand that to mean?
As I said, my complete understanding of material limited combustibility was limited, but clearly Phil had considered it important because he highlighted it, so I would have assumed that was correct. And I mean, since then I've looked at it and I understand that there's more than one route you can go, and that would be a requirement that was met by another test. But at the time I would have taken that as being correct.
You said your understanding was limited, but at the time, did you consider, well, what test evidence was that based on?
Well, I did ask Phil what tests he'd used.
Yes, we'll come to that in a moment. And that was an important question for you to ask, wasn't it? What test evidence is this based on? Let's look at that.
Are we going to leave this document now?
We're going to come to another email string where we've still got that there. But if Mr. Chairman, if you want to ask anything more about...
I'd just like to ask Dr. Rochefort, I mean, would you consider K15 to be a material of limited combustibility?
Now I wouldn't, because I know
even
that it's...
then?
I wouldn't have... It wouldn't have struck me as odd, shall I just say that? Because as far as I was concerned, my mindset was it's phenolic. It's the best performing polymeric insulin thermostat set around. Maybe that's what it could be. So it could have been referring to the material as far as I was concerned at that stage.
I mean, you did know it was combustible because you
yes,
did that very early on.
But that distinction between limited combustibility, if it had said, for example, since K15 can be considered an A2 Euroclass material,
yes,
I would have said, hang on, it isn't that.
yes.
But material limited combustibility wouldn't have stood out to me, and subsequently I would have understood that it had to do some tests in order to be considered.
I'm just wondering whether at the time you would have described it yourself to anyone else as a material of limited combustibility.
I don't think it's a term I would generally use. I would try to be more specific about what tests had passed.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, Ms. Grange.
Yes. As technical director, were you not curious to understand precisely what was meant by material of limited combustibility?
No, I mean, I would have taken the whole paragraph and thought, yeah, great, that's good. LABC, as far as I was concerned, a reputable authority considered the product was suitable above 18 metres, therefore that's good news.
If we can look at the top of this email chain on this page, is there an email above this? Yeah. So we can see that about an hour later on the same day, 1610, you email just Mr. Heath and you say, out of curiosity, which fire test results did we use to get this? Regards, Malcolm. Do you see that there?
Yes.
I think we've agreed that that was a very important question, wasn't it?
With retrospect, it is a very important question. I was curious as what he'd used.
Yeah.
And the fact that it was an hour later, I don't know whether that's significant or not, because we were in different places. I could have been doing other things. So.
And then we see Mr. Heath's response to you at the top of that page later that day. And he says this, he says, "We can be very convincing when we need to be. We threw every bit of fire test data we could at him. We probably blocked his server. In the end, I think the LABC convinced themselves Cooltherm is the best thing since sliced bread. We didn't even have to get any real ale down him!" Exclamation mark. Phil, do you see that there?
Yes, I do, yeah.
Would you agree that that email conveys the impression that he was surprised at how convincing he'd been with the LABC?
Not necessarily. I think I was aware that he and Andrew Pack were working on this, purely from the email from Phil. And I know Andrew is a very detailed guy and would know his stuff back to front. So if Andrew was involved along with Phil, I would have thought all the necessary information was provided to the LABC.
Were you surprised yourself at the sections relating to the use of K15 in buildings over 18 metres in height?
No, that was what the certificate clearly it states there in Phil's email.
But you've been telling us that you knew that you still needed to keep on testing to find an 8414 Part 2 test that you could pass, yes?
Yes, that's correct, because
you knew that.
Because we'd failed in those system tests, yes, and there was still a problem there that needed sorting.
Yes. And so you knew that, didn't you, that the only bit of fire test data you had was the 2005 test at this point, yes? That was all that there was in Kingspan's file.
No, I didn't know that. I assumed there were other fire tests that he used.
Well, which other fire tests?
I don't know. That was my assumption.
Because the fire tests you've been told about, sorry, let me finish my question, in 2007 and 2008 were all failures. You've been told you can't get the Euro class, you've been told you can't get the national class naught, and you've been told about 4 failures to 8414. So how did you think that there was other testing which had justified this result?
Sorry, we did have Euroclass. We had Euroclass CS1D0.
You were told that you couldn't achieve...
Sorry, let Dr. Rochefort answer the question.
We had Euroclass S1C D0.
What I was referring to there, sorry, if I can clarify, was that you'd been told that the Euro class, you were struggling to get the same Euro class. Do you remember we saw that in Ivor's document?
That was one comment from Ivor, and I don't know if that was reality or not, or one test that Ivor did on an unknown product that gave that result. So I had no proof one way or the other. I don't know what other tests they were doing at this time. But the way Phil phrases that, he says we threw every bit of fire test data we could at him. So that to me says there's an awful lot of other fire test data has gone into it. I don't know what that was, but that was the way he phrased the answer.
So should we understand that it was your view at the time that a lot of fire testing was going on of which you weren't aware?
Yeah, that's possible, because...
Well, was it your understanding at the time that there was a lot of fire testing going on of which you hadn't been informed?
That's also possible. It's quite possible, because the Technical Service Department did their own testing, and they also had access to tests where the product had been tested in, I don't know, apart from European tests. There were tests, Singapore tests, there were Chinese tests, there was Australian tests, I think. So there was a lot of other information out there. I don't know how convincing it would have been, but it's possible that there were other tests. There was other test data.
Right, thank you. Sorry, Ms. Grange.
That's okay. Isn't it right that as the person in control of the budget, you would have had to sign off on the costs of any other testing?
Not if it was done in another department. I wouldn't.
Which other department are you talking about?
It could have been done in production department, operations. It could have been done at one of our subsidiaries abroad. I don't know.
Dr. Rochefort, are you saying this is actually what you thought at the time, that there must be other fire test information that I'm not aware of, that doesn't appear in any of the monthly reports or the other technical feedback that I'm getting, so I don't need to worry about it because there must be that other body of test data? Is that what you actually thought at the time?
That is what I actually thought at the time, yes.
Did you ever get a proper response from Mr. Heath? This response doesn't actually tell you what test data you used. It doesn't answer your question. What you ask, which fire test results did we use to get this? Did you ever get a proper response to that question?
I don't think I got anything in writing, whether Phil came along at some point. And I don't know where Phil was physically and where I was physically during this interchange. So.
You're the technical director. You can see that this is a great moment in the lifetime of K15. Why didn't you ask for a proper answer to that question? What fire test data did we use to get that? Why didn't you follow up on it?
Well, I trusted the department, and I had no reason not to trust them. Philip Heath was a very experienced guy. Andrew Pack was extremely experienced as well. So that was the situation at the time.
Can we go now to a different email from the 11th of May, a little bit later than this, KIN 405382, with the subject Phenolic Fire Focus Group. Do you see this? So this is an email a few days later on the 11th of May 2009, and you're CC'd in here. Do you see that?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And it's attached as the LABC system approval certificate. We can see that. And Mr. Heath says, following the success of receiving the attached LABC accreditation that now satisfies the requirements for K15 being installed above 18 metres, we should cease any further fire test for ventilated rain screens. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Now, did that make sense to you, that the LABC accreditation now satisfies the requirements for K15 being installed above 18 metres?
No, it didn't surprise me at the time. Sorry, it didn't. Can you just rephrase the question?
Yeah, did that make sense to you, that he's saying that the LABC accreditation now satisfies the requirements for K15 being installed above 18 metres?
Well, yes, it did, because I believe that the LABC's certification was correct. So.
But how did that make sense? You said that you knew about large-scale 8414 testing, yes? And you'd been aware that there'd been failed tests to try and meet that test standard.
Failed system tests, yes. I don't know the details, how the details of the system compared with the details as put down in the LABC certificate. So my assumption would have been that if provided that LABC advice is followed, then that is acceptable.
Right. And Mr. Heath is saying now that we've got that certificate, we should cease any further fire tests for ventilated rain screens. Did you agree with that it was right to stop testing at this point, given what you've got in the LABC certificate?
I can see why he's saying it, because of the cost of the tests. I thought we should carry on work, and I think we did in the fire focus groups, to understand that and other things as well about the product, to see if we can at some point in the future repeat tests if it was appropriate.
So do I get this right, that actually at the time you thought you should carry on work on 8414 large-scale testing?
Well, no, I could see that we had the LABC certification, and therefore it wasn't a necessity to do the 8414 Part 2 or Part 1 testing. But clearly we need to get to the bottom of why it was performing differently, and that was the work that I was keen to carry on doing.
Can you explain why the LABC certificate meant it wasn't necessary to do the 8414 testing? Can you explain why you were of that understanding?
from the explanation given by Philip Heath.
But on the basis of what test evidence?
Well, that, as I said, I had assumed that there was a lot of test evidence given, a lot of details given to the LABC to achieve this certificate.
I see. And then he goes on, at in excess of 15k per test, both the sales and business development teams should be adept enough to use their toolkit to the full. The pressure is on other component suppliers of this method of construction to obtain similar statements or prove their non-combustible statements. Do you see that there?
Yes.
And then he goes on, this saving will allow other applications and the Cooltherm brand to achieve a similar focus to that given to K15 over recent years, and look at how the sales in this have grown. Therefore, the focus on this group should be on the other Cooltherm applications where we do not have the complete sales toolkit. We should also be considering fire tests, smoke tests, etc. that may not be relevant for either construction or the end-use application. Provided it has a good marketing story, these should be tabled. Now, that last sentence, did you think that was appropriate for Mr. Heath to be saying in this email, that you should consider fire tests, smoke tests that may not be relevant for either construction or end-use application, provided it's got a good marketing story, they should be tabled?
Well, I can see it looks as like he's just doing it for marketing reasons. From my point of view, any tests that showed the phenolic product in a positive light were worth pursuing, because you never know when they might be useful in the future. And if it's, yes, I mean, marketing, we're making and selling products, so you'd obviously try and you do things and then see if you try and do things that could potentially give you a new market, but you'd also look at what tests you've got and what other markets you can get into. It's a natural commercial activity.
Did you think it was appropriate to be providing test evidence that might not be relevant, provided it's got a good marketing story? Did you endorse that approach as technical director?
No, I think what he's saying there, maybe I've misread it, but what he's saying there, it may not be relevant for the either construction and end-use application. What can we do to show that phenolic is a better material in terms of its fire performance and insulation performance compared to other insulent materials? That was a natural thing to try and do for the Cooltherm brand.
I see. Just standing back from this email and thinking about this email and the Great News email, would you agree that you knew full well at this time that this was a get-out-of-jail card? It bought Kingspan time because it was not managing to pass the 8414 Part 2. That's the reality, isn't it?
No, I didn't think that. I thought this was an alternative route they'd gone for accreditation of 8414 Part 2, or above 18 metres, and therefore was valid in its own right. So that was my approach to it.
And what was that alternative route?
I don't know. I mean, I certainly didn't know at the time. I just assumed that the LABC had been convinced, and as a reputable body, that the certificate was correct.
Did you think that other body of test evidence that you hadn't seen included tests at 8414 that were shown to the LABC? Did you assume that at the time?
I don't know. I don't know what I assumed at the time in terms of what those tests were.
And did you agree with the decision to stop testing?
I can see from a cost point of view, it made sense if we didn't need to do the tests, because I think that 15k was probably an underestimate for what the tests cost. It was also taking a lot of resource, so if we actually didn't need to do the tests, then it was sensible to apply that resource elsewhere.
If we can look now at some meeting minutes, KIN 30200737. This is the first meeting of the Fire Focus Group on phenolic. Do you see that there?
Yes.
And you're present Ivor Meredith takes the minutes.
Yes.
Do you see that there? And if we look on page 1, we can see, if we read under background, it says the meeting was called to organise, agree and understand the current fire testing requirements and mandatory product development of our new technology, Cooltherm. There are several fire performance requirements that are crucial for sales of phenolic. However, in some areas on development, phenolic products, we are falling just short of the mark. This group was originally pulled together as we believe we must have the BS 8414 parts 1 and 2, the fire test for masonry and steel frame, fire propagation test on Cooltherm K15. Then it says this: following the recent release of the K15 BBA and the LABC land tac approval, this urgent requirement has been relaxed, as the documents are working to cover the regulatory desires for specific system approval. Other areas of concern relate to the surface spread fire performance of the product that we are concerned may have reduced. This can be seen in recent 476 Part 7 tests and the most recent attempt at UL for the new technology cool duct. Do you see that there?
I think that's Underwriters Laboratory, the UL.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So can you see there, it's clearly being recorded in a meeting that you're present at, that the urgent requirement for that 8414 testing has been relaxed, as the documents are working to cover the regulatory desires for specific system approval. Do you see that?
Yes. Yeah.
What did you understand that to mean when you read it? How could those documents be covering the regulatory desires for specific system approval if you hadn't had any passes to 8414?
I would have assumed it was correct, that there was an alternative route to get the specific system approval.
I see. The sentence, we still need to look at developing a product that will be able to pass a BS 8414 Part 2 test, confirms that Kingspan did not have any version of K15 in May 2005, which as part of a system could pass a large-scale fire test to BS 8414. That's right, isn't it?
Can you just repeat that question?
Yes, the sentence, we still need to look at developing a product that will be able to pass a BS 8414 test.
Where does it say that, sorry?
Sorry, maybe that's further down. Yes, I'm so sorry. I'm sorry. In item 2, I beg your pardon. Still on page 1.
Oh, right, okay.
Sorry. It's there. If under Cooltherm K15 facade test, it says, following discussions, it was agreed that we still need to look at developing a product that will be able to pass a BS 8414 Part 2 test as a backup to the LABC documentation. Do you see that there?
Yes.
So does that confirm that Kingspan didn't have any version of K15 at this time, May 2009, which as part of a system could pass the large-scale fire test to Part 2 of 8414?
Well, we knew that we'd done, probably by this time, 4 8414 Part 2 system tests with other suppliers. So the fact that it would be desirable to get a BS 8414 Part 2 test made sense.
I see. In fact, it's right, isn't it, and we'll come to this later, that no further 8414 testing actually was carried out again until 2014.
That's correct, yes.
Yeah.
Sorry, can I just take one step back? As far as I know, that's correct. There might have been some indicatives that I didn't know about. For example, when in one of the chains of emails, Gwyn asked the question about, did an old process fail the test? And Ivor says, yes, it did. Indicated to me there must have been a test that I wasn't aware of, so there could have been other tests out there.
Right. Now, you were asked by the inquiry if you had at any stage been made aware of any complaints about Kingspan in relation to K15. And if we go to your response in your witness statement, this is at paragraph 4.15 on page 17. You say there that you're aware that during the period July 13 to November 13, an issue did arise in respect of concerns about the fire performance of K15 raised by Wintec, who described themselves as facade engineering consultants. Do you see that there?
Yes.
And I want to move on to some questions about those issues with Wintec. If we can go to KIN 405683, and I want to look on page 2, about 2/3 of the way down the page. There's an email there from Gareth Mills. Do you see there? And it's CC'd to you, 24th of July 2013. Do you see that there? And the title of the email is Downing Developments K15 Jobs 18-metre Wintec Issues. Do you see that?
Yep.
And then he says there, we may need to relook at the issues we are having with regards to some of the K15 jobs I've highlighted in recent weeks. Specifically for the 2 Downing development jobs, I've been in contact with Andy Russell of the BRE to aid with the assessment that they were doing as per our discussions last week. But he has advised Keyclad today that due to the limited test data we have, they are not able to complete the assessment and said we either need a BS 8414 Part 2 result, apparently would not have to exactly match the proposed construction provided it was a BS 8414 Part 2 rain screen result, or a limited combustibility or better test result, which would, if available, negate the need for the assessment. And then following getting this information via Anthony Martin of Keyclad, John Lazel, the Keyclad MD, has phoned up, not very happy, and has asked if either Tony or Malcolm can ring him in the morning to discuss the resolutions. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Now, did you know what discussions he's referring to? Do you see in that second paragraph, in the second line, he says, as per our discussions last week, specifically for the 2 Downing developed jobs, I've been in contact with Andy Russell of the BRE to aid with the assessment they're doing as per our discussions last week. Had you been involved in any discussions?
I don't think so. I think this is to Tony and Ivor, so...
Yes.
I know I'm copied in, but I
Yeah.
don't think I was involved.
You don't recall those?
I think he's copied me because the Keyclad MD wants to talk to someone senior about it. I would assume that's
Yes.
what it was.
Yes, that appears right. And then going down to page 3, looking at the rest of his email, he sets out what the system was on that wall construction, plasterboard, steel stud filled with rock wool, Versa panel, etc. And then he gives some details of horizontal and vertical cavity barriers. And then he says this in the penultimate paragraph. If anyone has any advice on how to progress, Keyclad want us to do a further BS 8414 test, although this may not be practical, so any advice would be appreciated. Do you see that there?
Yes.
And we've seen he's asked that either Tony Millichap or you call the managing director of Keyclad. Now, moving up the chain, in the middle of page 2, we can see that you respond the following morning on the 25th of July. And you say, Gareth, I'm in meetings all morning, but should be able to call him about 1 p.m. Please let him know. Either please forward or link me to our BS 8414 pass result. Do you see that there? Why did you step in at this point and not leave it to Tony Millichap to deal with?
I assume Tony was busy. The guy is after talking to someone senior. Whether I'd had a conversation with Tony or not, I don't know, but that would be the only reason. Incidentally, I can't remember if I did talk to him or if Tony
I'll
talked
come
to
to
him.
that.
Okay.
I'll come to that. If your involvement in fire testing was only at a high level, what did you hope to contribute to this particular discussion with them?
I was only involved because, as far as I understand it, the Keyclad MD had asked to talk to one of us, so that would be the only reason.
And when you would say, please forward or link me to our BS 8414 pass result, that could only be the test from May 2005, yes?
I assume so, yes.
On the masonry system,
Yes.
which you knew predated the change to new technology K15, yes?
Yes, well, I think I would have known by then, yeah.
Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. Apparently the transcript stopped. Okay. Sorry, I think there's been a problem with the system.
Oh,
Do we need to take a break? Okay.
How long do you think it might take? 5 minutes? Should we have a break now then? We might as well take the afternoon break early, mightn't we?
Yes, that's sensible.
We always have a break in the afternoon, Dr. Rochefort. We don't normally have it quite as early as this.
but as early as this now.
In the circumstances, we'll take it now and we'll come back at 3:10, please.
Okay.
And no discussing your evidence. All right? Thank you very much. Right, 3:10, please. Good. Now, first question. As far as we know, is everything working? Good. Thank you very much. Well, we've now had our break, so we're ready to keep cracking on. Would you ask Dr. Rochefort to come in, please? Okay. Right, Dr. Rochefort. Well, ready to carry on, I hope.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Yes, Miss Grange.
Yes, thank you. We were looking at an email chain which was relevant to concerns that had been raised by Wintec in 2013. If we could go back to that chain, KIN 405683, and if I can pick it up at the top of page 2. So we can see that Joel Clark has sent you the following link. The following will link you to our BS 8414 test report. Do you see that there?
Yeah.
They sent you a link. And then the next email up in the chain is from you. It starts at the bottom of page 1 and on to page 2. If we just pick it up, just look at the start of it, so we can see you've sent it to Joel Clark, CC and Gareth Mills, Tony Millichap, Ivor Meredith. And then if we look at what you've said at the top of page 2, you say, thanks, I'm checking, but what does the part 2 test involve? Regards, Malcolm. Do you see that there?
Mm-hmm. Yes, sorry.
Did you not know in 2013 what the BS 8414 part 2 test involved?
I think in terms of detail, I didn't, no.
Did you know it was a test on a steel frame structure?
I think I probably would have known that.
Right.
But, sorry, what I was going to say was certainly after the meeting with Wintec, I definitely knew it, but I think I probably would have known it at this point.
Yeah. I mean, we've looked at a lot of notes from 2007, 2008, when the 8414 Part 2 tests are taking place on the steel frame systems. So do you agree that by this time you would have understood that it would have involved the steel frame
Yep.
system, even if you didn't know a bit more about the detail of it?
Yes, I think that's a better clarification. Thank you.
Yeah. And then in his email back to you, about halfway down page 1, sent at 13:35, we go to that now. Joel Clark says, hi Malcolm, attached, the primary difference is substrate, part 2 specifically for steel frame structures. And then he says, I don't think there is a major difference in the test configuration and method, just that this deals specifically with steel frame buildings. And then he says, part 2 is, I believe, now explicitly referenced in part B of the building regulations. And then he says, our 84141 test was undertaken on steel frame with non-combustible substrate prior to part 2 being issued, as I understand it. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Now, did you pick up at the time that Mr. Clark, a senior technical advisor, was telling you that it was a test on a steel frame, the 8414 Part 1 test? Did that make any sense to you?
It probably shouldn't have made any sense, but I'm in the middle of, presumably, trying to prep for a telephone conversation, and Joe was sending me some information, so I would have assumed that there was a steel frame involved with that 8414 Part 1 test. But I agree, in retrospect, it doesn't seem to make any sense. But
would you agree if you'd read the test report that was sent to you by Mr. Clark, you would have understood that that 2005 test was carried out on a masonry substrate?
Presumably, I would have done.
You've been telling us up to today that your understanding was that K15 could only be used on buildings provided it was with a masonry substrate. That's right, isn't it?
What, with a non-combustible substrate, that was my understanding.
With a masonry substrate, I think is what you said earlier on today.
I said masonry or cementitious,
Yeah.
non-combustible substrate.
Right. If we go to the very top of the email chain, we can see another email from you, and you say this, just checked, our test, BRE 220876, was on a blockwork substrate. However, it does appear that a BS 8414 Part 2 only came out in 2005 and our test was completed in 2005. So it's possible that it was the only test available at the time. BS 84 Part 1 came out in 2002. And then you say, in either's absence, could you or Gareth please check when we could reschedule a BS 8414 Part 2 and the limited combustibility test? What standard is this? ? So we have this information to hand. Presumably the latter will be quicker. Do you see that there?
Yes.
So is it right that at this time you wanted to schedule a limited combustibility test for K15?
Yes, and I clearly didn't know what it was, so that's why I'm asking. I think I must have read the report.
And were you unaware at the time that K15 could not ever pass such a test or tests to get limited combustibility? It could never achieve A1 or A2 or the right test under 476 Part 11, could it?
I certainly would have known it couldn't have been an A1 or A2. I don't think I was familiar with the 476 Part 11
Right.
test.
Now, looking at the correspondence with Joel Clark and Gareth Mills, do you consider that you were, in fact, in a position to assist with the queries that had been raised by Wintec?
Probably not, because I don't think I was very well briefed on it, but I assumed this was a question of talking to a customer and finding out what exactly the problem was.
What was the outcome of your discussions with Keyclad? Can you remember?
I do recall that I spoke to someone when I was in Seoul in South Korea, and whether this was that occasion, it might have been. I can't even remember his name.
What did you tell them? Did you tell them it was okay to use K15?
No, I would have. I think it's from my vague recollection of the South Korea phone call. It was he was asking about tests, and I was trying to clarify that, and would have got back to whoever it was dealing with it.
Right. Now, if we look at your witness statement at this point, the, paragraph 4.16 on page 17, you say this, you say Wintec were concerned that Kingspan did not have an 8414 Part 2 test on K15. That is to say, a test with a steel frame substrate as opposed to a masonry substrate. This matter had been escalated to me, and to resolve it, I liaised internally with the technical projects team to confirm the basis upon which to respond. I met Wintec personnel and was involved in some correspondence with those involved at Wintec in order to try and resolve those concerns by referring them to the BBA certificate and LABC documentation that we had at that time. Following this exchange with Wintec and others in the industry, I recall that we conducted a programme of further 8414 Part 2 testing. Do you see that there?
Yes, I do, yeah.
Can you help us? How did you try and resolve their concerns by reference to the BBA certificate and the LABC documentation?
I think that would have been what was available to me at the time. I'm not sure why I was talking to Wintec without advice from Tony or Phil, or it would have been Tony at this time. Whether Tony was not available or not, I don't know, but...
Would you agree that there was nothing referred to in the BBA certificate or the LABC documentation which referred to a successful pass to 8414 Part 2 on a steel-framed substrate?
I believe that was the case. And following the meeting with Wintec, I think that was made clear to me.
And is it right that in October 2013 you met with Paul Savage and Stuart Taylor of Wintec, along with the UK Managing Director of Kingspan, Peter Wilson?
Yes.
Why did Kingspan's Managing Director, Peter Wilson, attend the meeting with you?
I think because it was a major customer and a major specifier. Wintec were facade engineering consultants.
By the time you attended that meeting, had you learnt that K15 was not a product of limited combustibility?
Again, you're using a term that I wasn't very familiar with, and I honestly can't remember what my understanding of that would have been at the time.
What are your recollections of that meeting in terms of what was said about K15's suitability for use above 18 metres?
I can't remember details, but I did take some notes in my diary, I think, from that meeting. I don't know if you've had a copy of that, have you?
Have we? We'll check. I'm not aware that we've had a copy.
Oh,
of
okay.
that. Okay, we'll check. What do those notes say? I mean, you've obviously looked at them.
They're notes to myself, so they don't make a lot of sense, but it just says... no, I honestly can't remember the details. You need to look at the details. They're not extensive notes. They're just...
Okay.
And I was told that you've been sent the diary extract, so I assume you have.
Can I ask you where the diary is now?
The diary has been completely photocopied, the whole lot, and I understood, and then it's been looked at in detail, and certain relevant sections have been copied, as I understood, to council.
Right. Well, we'll make our own inquiries, but just in case we needed any further help, do you have the diary in your?
I have the diary. Yeah, I'm a bit of a hoarder. I keep all this stuff, and it has been. It took a long time to go through everything.
Sure.
Yeah. So.
Do you have any other notebooks or diaries or any records?
No, that was the only thing, and it's something I just do out of habit. I take notes.
Perhaps you would ensure that you don't part with it.
Absolutely. No, I definitely didn't. But I was under the impression that you had got all these
maybe we
relevant
have, but
pieces,
I just wanted to be clear of where we are.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. We've had a lot of very late disclosure from Kingspan that we've been trying to look through as a matter of urgency. So we will follow up on that. You refer in your witness statement to an exchange of correspondence following that meeting with Wintech. Can we go to those emails? It's at KIN 403823. And I want to look on page 2 to your email to Wintech sent on the 31st of October 2013 at 13:25. Do you see that there? And you say, thank you for seeing us this morning. So it's to Paul Savage and Stuart Taylor, and it's CCing Peter Wilson and Mark Harris. And you say, thank you for seeing us this morning to discuss facade installation systems. We were pleased to hear you would like to do more work involving Kingspan's installation systems. And then you say, as mentioned, we are confident that our K15 rain screen board is suitable for facade use above 18 metres, given the correct design and installation, and I enclose our BBA and LABC certification to this effect. As you are aware, we have been successfully assessed by the BBA and LABC on the basis of our BS 8414 Part 1 test conducted at the BRE and have not seen the necessity of an extensive test programme to BS 8414 Part 2, considering the apparent contradictory advice in the scope of 8414 Part 2, see scope of Parts 1 and 2 attached. And then you go on. However, I note your concern that the BRE are reluctant to assess for certain constructions to BR 135 on the basis of our existing test result, and we'll discuss this matter with them, Tony Baker, as you suggest. As discussed, we will target resolving this issue within 6 months if further testing is required by them, or sooner if not, I hope. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Now, going back to the start of that paragraph, you say, as mentioned, we are confident that our K15 rain screen board is suitable for facade use above 18 metres, given correct design and installation, and I enclose those certificates. You don't say there, do you? It's only suitable on a masonry substrate.
No, I was using the advice from the BBA and LABC certificates.
And you don't explain that... you go on and you talk about your 8414 Part 1 test. You've been successfully assessed by the BBA and LABC on the basis of that 8414 Part 1 test conducted at the BRE and have not seen the necessity of an extensive test programme. You don't explain to them that you've changed the composition of K15 to new technology K15 since that time, do you?
I don't know.
And you don't explain, do you, that there had been a test programme to 8414 Part 2 in 2007 and 2008, which resulted in a number of very significant failures, do you?
They were systems, they were commercial systems from other companies, and it wouldn't be appropriate to divulge information about them. So that would be the reason for that.
In what design or installation circumstances did you, in October 2013, consider K15 to be suitable for facade use over 18 metres?
I would have used the BBA and LABC certification, so that's why I was emailing it to them.
Yes, but as you've stated there, that's on the basis of the 8414 Part 1 test done in 2005.
Yes.
Yes. So how were you relying on that in a steel frame situation, Part 2 situation, and given you've now changed the K15 that you're actually producing and selling?
Well, as far as the certification was concerned, that was my understanding that gave us the ability to do it. With the old technology, new technology change, as we've discussed, yes, there was a change. My view was that the product itself was not vastly different in terms of its construction anyway. But at this time, I'm not sure what my understanding of that, what was tested in 2005 was actually. By then,
sorry.
I mean, I hadn't been looking at it for quite a few years, and by then I don't think I was as clear about what that was.
So
It was
why?
done.
Sorry.
The test was carried out at a time when we were changing the technologies.
Why are you giving this advice if you're not that clear in your own mind? This is, you know that serious concerns have been raised about the use of K15 above 18 metres. It's been escalated up to you. Peter Wilson is now involved. How can you be giving this advice if you're not completely sure the basis on which you're giving it?
I'm not giving advice. I'm just giving them information. They're the experts in this. I'm just giving them information, and to be honest, this wasn't a normal activity I would undertake. I've been involved in this because the issue was escalated. So, following that meeting that we had on the 31st of October, then I would have been aware that they needed a 8414 Part 2 test.
With respect, you're not just giving information here. You're saying in that first line of that second paragraph, we are confident that our K15 rain screen board is suitable for facade use over 18 metres.
Given the correct design and installation.
Yes. And you enclose the BBA and LABC certificate to this effect.
Yes.
And you say you've been successfully assessed by those organisations on the basis of the 8414 Part 1 test.
Yes.
So on the basis of that one test, you're giving this advice?
Well, that was my understanding at the time. I mean, with hindsight.
Can I ask you, just to help me with this, you refer to the correct design and installation. What systems did you understand K15 could be used as part of?
My understanding was that it could be used against a non-combustible substrate.
Yes.
With a non-combustible cladding material. That was my understanding.
And that was the limit of its scope of use, as far as you understood.
As far as I understood, yes.
Yes, all right, thank you.
And when you say non-combustible substrate, do you mean non-combustible substrate on a steel frame?
I don't think I would have been considering that, actually, either way. If someone told me that that was acceptable, I would have taken that as being acceptable.
That's what's said in the LABC certificate. We looked at that earlier. It says you can use it in a steel frame system with a non-combustible substrate. Do you recall?
Yeah, well, that's why I would have assumed.
Yes, but
non-combustible.
What test evidence was there that K15 could be used on a non-combustible substrate like a calcium silicate board, which is what's said in the LABC certificate, with a steel frame system? Where was the test evidence to support that?
I had assumed that the test evidence that this 8414 Part 1 test that was done gave the ability to be able to use that against any non-combustible substrate. That would have been my understanding of it at the
I
time.
see. And even though you've changed the technology of K15 since, and all you've had since on 8414 is a series of failures.
On systems with other people, we did 4 tests, and I think there were 4 failures. That's correct.
Now, you go on to say, from the end of that 6th line, you say, we saw it. However, I note your concern that the BRE are reluctant to assess for certain constructions to BR135 on the basis of our existing test result. What was the concern that the BRE were reluctant to assess for certain constructions? What were those certain constructions?
I can't recall, but presumably that was steel frame.
And then
I don't
you
know.
say, as discussed, we'll target resolving this issue within 6 months if further testing is required by then. Did you accept at the time that Wintec's concerns were valid ones to be raising?
I think that they'd obviously convinced me and presumably Peter Wilson in the meeting, and I see Mark Harris, I think, was also involved in the meeting, that they were serious concerns. So I think possibly prior to this, they might have been seen as causing trouble, a bit of an irritant rather than anything else. I think following this meeting, we could see that they're serious, see that they've got a valid point, and therefore we need to be working on it.
When you say prior to this, they might have been seen as causing trouble by who? Who had thought they were causing
I just think
trouble?
probably from the sales team, they
Now, if we remove to Wintec's response now, which is the next email up in the chain, sent by Paul Savage the same day, 22/11, we go up to the top, there we see his response. And in essence, I'll read it out to you. Paul Savage urges Kingspan to either have K15 reclassified or conduct further fire testing.
He does say, although I do appreciate that the scope of this specific standard is stated to exclude rain screens and external render systems, which is what I pointed out to him in my email.
Right, so he says, with regard to your comment in respect to not undertake an 8414 test, although I do appreciate that the scope of this specific standard is stated to exclude rain screens and in external render systems, I would ask how you intend to validate the use of K15 in conjunction with a steel frame system cement board build-up, as there will appear to be no test standard to cover this. Do you see that there? So what was the point you were making about the scope of 8414 Part 2? Had you tried to say that that was limited in some way?
Yeah, I think I'd read that probably for the first time for a number of years anyway. I'd read the 841 Part 1 and 2, I think either just after the meeting or prior to the meeting. And it clearly stated in the scope that it excluded rain screens and external render systems. So it was odd that the standard said that, and I was pointing that out to Paul Savage and Stuart Taylor.
Right, I see. But he's going on, isn't he? And he's saying, although he appreciates that, he's asking how you intend to validate the use of K15 in conjunction with a steel frame system cement board build-up, as there'd appear to be no test standard to cover this. So he's saying, well, even if you're right about that, how are you going to validate that? Because there would be no test standard.
Yeah, I think he makes a good point. But
Yeah. And then he says, Part B of the building regulation still requires that either a material of limited combustibility is used or a test to BS 8414 or BR 135 assessment is undertaken when used in instances over 18 metres high. Do you see that there?
Yeah, or an equivalent assessment body, a sufficient bank of test data to provide
Yes.
BR 135 desktops.
When he's talking about a material being either of limited combustibility or used in the 8414 test, by this time, did you understand what a material of limited combustibility meant?
I don't think I did. In fact, I think on my diary notes, which I'm sure you'll find, it would be for this date, 31st of October.
Well, I'm being told they're not disclosed to us. That's
that was my understanding.
what I've been told.
They were.
Well, no doubt they could be if we asked for them, could they?
Yes, I'm sure they could be.
And I don't. Sorry, if they are disclosed, they've not been disclosed to core participants. Sorry. They've been disclosed to us,
That's
but
what I
they
thought,
haven't
so.
yet been disclosed to others.
Right,
So,
okay, I thought so.
well, let's just press on with this for a moment.
But there's actually a note to myself about check limited combustibility, so obviously I wasn't clear about the...
And what date is that note made?
It's made on this day, 31st of October 2013.
Right.
It's handwritten notes for the meeting.
And that's the first time you thought to check what limited combustibility meant, is it?
Well, it's being raised with me, and I'm obviously reading his response, I presume. Well, no, they must have said this in the meeting, because I think the notes are from the meeting.
And then he goes on, generally Wintec is contractually obliged to ensure our clients' building facades comply with building regulations. Without documented proof, we cannot do this for your K15 board. And then he says, I do hope that you're planning to proceed with testing following your discussions with BRE. As we stated, BRE have relayed to Wintec that their view is that the test Kingspan have already undertaken simply justifies that the construction tested complies with the requirements of BS 84 Part 1 only, and that this single test cannot be used to infer that all other forms of construction, including K15 boards, are also accepted. Do you see that?
Mm-hmm.
And then if we
Yes.
go down to the next paragraph, he says, until such a reclassification is confirmed, or the provision of satisfactory test data is made available, Wintec cannot alter our position on the use of this material for facades over 18 metres high, and will have no alternative but to recommend to our clients that your K15 board is not considered for such applications unless supported with appropriate project-specific testing or a BR 135 assessment. And then he says, during our meeting, I understood that there is now a commitment from Kingspan to undertake such tests and to provide the test data within a 6-month period. And then he says, following completion of this period, if the situation remains unresolved, Wintec will have no alternative but to make public our concerns to the industry at large. This stance may not always be appreciated by our clients. Nevertheless, we do take fire safety very seriously and, of course, have a duty of care to public safety. With regard to the inconsistencies within 8414, other documents noted and poorly drafted clauses in, I think it means ADB, I trust that the underlying requirement of preventing the spread of fire up building facades is clear and that Kingspan will behave in a responsible manner to properly resolve the doubt over the use of K15 and not be distracted by such inconsistencies. Do you see that there?
Yes, absolutely, yeah.
Now, is this the reason Kingspan then began a further programme of testing in January 2014 to BS 8414 Part 2?
That's my understanding, that this was the reason, yes.
So it's the threat of exposure to the wider industry that prompted that restarting of 8414 Part 2 tests. Do you agree?
No, I think it's more a realisation, if you like, at senior level, that there was an issue here around the certification.
Well, Dr. Rochefort, what I'm going to put to you is that you always knew there was an issue around the certification, but the LABC certificate had bought you time. But when that expired and when consultants like Wintec started raising their concerns, Kingspan were forced into the position of having to start that programme of testing again. Do you agree?
No.
So why hadn't Kingspan been testing to BS 8414 Part 2 prior to this point?
Well, we had a few years earlier, obviously, along with other customers. As far as I was concerned at this time, you can see from my email, I believed that the LABC and BBA certification was enough.
But we've just discussed that the only thing that had to underpin it was a 2005 test that was on old technology K15.
I know with hindsight, but at the time that was actually what I believed.
But can you accept that with hindsight that was wholly inappropriate to take that position?
To take what position, sorry?
That it was appropriate to rely on that one single 8414 test from 2005 on old technology K15 in a masonry situation?
I think it was with hindsight, it was inappropriate to rely on. Yes, I do agree with that. But at the time, my belief was that the certification from LABC and BBA gave us enough that satisfied the requirement.
Yeah. You respond to Paul Savage the following day, top of your email at page 1, and you say, "Dear Paul, I think you may have misinterpreted my response. Sorry if I didn't make it clear. I will be discussing with the BRE what is required and go with their recommendations. I understand from Ivor that Tony Baker no longer works in that area. He recommended I discuss the matter with his successor." And then you say, "Kingspan always acts in a responsible manner." Do you see that there?
Yes.
Do you stand by that comment? Is that your evidence? That
Yes.
Kingspan did always act in a responsible manner?
That was my belief.
Why not tell Wintec about the new technology K15 and that you'd had no relevant fire test results since developing that new product?
Because that wasn't my belief. I believe that the LABC and BBA certification was enough. But now he's drawn it to my attention. We want to do the further 8414 Part 2 testing.
What consideration did you give to the issues of public safety that Wintec had raised?
Well, obviously, you take it seriously, yes.
How did you satisfy yourself at that stage in 2013 that safe advice, clear and accurate advice was being given about the use of K15 on buildings over 18 metres?
Again, as far as I was concerned, that the advice being given was to skilled people and giving them the information that we had available. So as far as I was concerned, each system that was designed and put into use was appropriately designed.
You said that you now were aware that you needed to do more tests after this exchange with Wintec. Did you do anything about the fact that no one had thought to draw this position to your attention before October 2013?
No, I don't think I did. I think that the conversation with Wintec probably started in July 2013, didn't it? In terms of the key clad.
Did you do anything about the fact that no one had thought to draw this position to your attention before Wintec did? I mean, it doesn't matter when they did, but did you do anything about that?
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. No, because my understanding was that the LABC and BBA certification was sufficient, and clearly Wintec had a problem with that. They weren't going to recommend our product, so it made sense to do the 8414 Part 2 testing.
So is it fair to say that the position was this? You didn't fully understand on what basis the LABC certificate was based, but you were nevertheless happy to rely upon it when it came to exchanges like this?
For this particular exchange, I was, because I definitely wasn't talking to someone who was unaware of the situation. These were experts in the area. So I knew that anything I said would be analysed extremely carefully by Wintec. I would not normally get involved in these kind of discussions with customers or specifiers. It wasn't my area of expertise.
Sorry, I'm going to put that to you again. Was the position this, that you didn't fully understand on what basis the LABC certificate was based, but you were nevertheless happy to rely on it when it came to exchanges like this with Wintec?
Because I believe the LABC certificate was correct.
Even though you didn't fully understand on what evidence it was based?
As I said before, I trusted the technical team to advise me correctly on that.
Let's move on now to the tests of 8414 Part 2, which were carried out by Kingspan in 2014. Would you accept that this exchange with Wintec had placed Kingspan under some pressure to provide evidence from testing to 8414 Part 2 on systems incorporating K15?
I think it had certainly focused our attention.
Were you also aware in late 2013 of some pressure on exactly the same topic from the NHBC?
I know that there were some discussions with the NHBC. I don't know how aware I was of the detail of those discussions.
But did you know that there was some pressure being exerted by the NHBC on exactly the same lines as that being imposed by Wintec?
I don't know that it was on exactly the same lines, but I was aware that there was discussion with the NHBC, yes.
And were you aware that the NHBC had raised concerns about the use of K15 on buildings over 18 metres?
Well, I was aware of that from the exchange with Wintec. They pointed it out.
Now, you've explained in your witness statement that following the meeting and the exchanges with Wintec in late 2013, Kingspan decided to embark on a programme of testing to 8414 Part 2 on systems incorporating K15.
Sorry, where is this?
Actually, I haven't got a reference for that, but you explain in your statement that there was this programme of testing in 2014. Can we look at a spreadsheet which has been produced for the inquiry by Kingspan? If we go to KIN 3022357, so what happened is the inquiry began asking questions of Kingspan about exactly what K15 product had been tested during each test to BS 8414. And this is the schedule dated the 31st of January 2020 that Kingspan then provided. Have you seen this spreadsheet previously?
I've seen it previous to this hearing. I hadn't seen it. I don't think I'd seen this during my time at Kingspan.
We can see that the columns along the top give us the test date, the sponsor, the details of the system tested, etc. And then in the sixth column, the properties of the tested insulation product. Do you see that there?
Yes.
And in the seventh column, it also gives details of whether the tested insulation product was the same as K15 being offered for sale by Kingspan at the time.
Yes.
And do you agree that that was an important question, whether what was being tested was the same as what was being sold?
Yes.
And in your witness statement for the transcript, this is paragraph 11.23 on page 51, you say that you would have expected any reliance on an 8414 report to make clear if the product was materially different from that which was being sold. Is that right?
It sounds right. Where was the...
Sorry, it's paragraph 11.23 in your witness statement, page 51, in the last two lines.
Yes, yes.
I would have expected any reliance on an 84142 report to make clear if the product was materially different. And you mean
yes.
Materially different to that which was being sold, yes?
Yes.
And would it be right that if a trial product was being tested to 8414 and therefore was being specifically manufactured for the purposes of testing, all those within Kingspan who were involved in the production of that sample and the testing itself would be aware that that was the case, yes?
I would think so, yeah.
Yeah. And you as technical director, in terms of, at the very least, budget planning, would have been aware of the costs associated with such testing, is that right?
I would have broadly. The budgets were planned at the beginning of the year or before the beginning of the year.
Yeah.
And some allocated for testing, which would cover a number of tests.
Yeah.
Essentially.
And were you aware in 2014 that there was some budget allocated to producing trial samples of K15 for the purposes of testing?
Yes.
Yeah. Now, in this spreadsheet, we can, if we go back to that spreadsheet, sorry, KIN 3022357. If we go on to page 3, we see the first of the 2014 tests, 7th of January 2014. Do you see that there?
Yes.
And we can see that the system tested in the third column is 8mm Trespa FR high pressure laminate. Do you see that there? HPL. Yes. And the properties of the insulation tested are said to be unknown. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Can you recall what the insulation product tested in that January 14 test was?
No, I think it might have been... I'm just trying to think. I think this might have been... well... It would be speculation. It could have been a blowing agent. I know we were looking at Solstice product at the time.
Yes, the Solstice comes in, I think, in the next two tests.
But I can't recall what it was.
Let's go to an internal presentation now, KIN 3021945, which appears to be an internal presentation prepared by Mr. Meredith in May 2015, called the Facade Insulation Solution. Do you see that there? And if we can go to page 17, there's a timeline of testing to date. Do you see that there?
Yes.
And the January 14 test is the third one up from the bottom.
Yep.
And can you see, it says there, Kingspan, the thickness is 80 millimetres. And it says K15, 25 micron unperforated on the formula facer. Do you see that
yes.
there? Does that help with your recollection that was carried out on standard K15 foam as sold, but with a non-standard unperforated foil facer?
If that was what it was, then obviously it's correct. I can't recall from the time what was tested. I know a number of things were tested.
Yeah. We could just look at some email correspondence from the time between you, Tony Millichap, Mr. Davis and Ivor Meredith. This is at KIN 3021095. If we go to the end of the document, at the end of the email chain, at the bottom of page 2, is from Mr. Meredith there on the 9th of January 2014, 1735. Do you see that there?
Where he says, if you look to the back page. Is that the one you mean?
Yes, if you look to the back page, you'll see where the 15-minute reference comes from. Do you see that there?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And then I think is there a note at the bottom of this page that says the entire message is not included? Do you see that there? But there seems to be some discussion going on about that January 2014 test. It's just 2 days after that test.
Right.
And just above Mr. Meredith's email, and all we have of it is that, you send an email saying, that implies we only just failed. Regards, Malcolm. Do you see that?
Yes.
Why did you say that?
Well, if I see the subject of Ivor's email below, he's got the subject 15 minutes. So I assume he's drawing something to my attention, well, mine, Tony's, Gwyn's and Lindsay's, about the performance of the system at 15 minutes.
Yeah.
And my comment there suggests that having a look at the whatever he sent, it would have been in less than an hour. My conclusion was that it looks like we only just failed. So I assume I was looking at the 600-degree limit at whatever I've forgotten the height now, but the height that's at. So that.
Yeah. Mr. Meredith then responds to you on the 13th of January. If we look at the bottom of page 1. And he says, you can see in the first line, he says, from the external temperatures, it does look very close. Do you see that there? The temperatures in the cavity were a little higher, but still close to the 15-minute window. Mm-hmm. And then he says, ideally, we need to pass with a 10% window for assessment. Anything too close will impede the BRE's ability to provide practical test assessments. Do you see that there? And then what he does, he says at the bottom of that page, it's with the above in mind, and after an extensive review of the test video and data, we're looking to consider the following. And what he does is give a detailed list of modifications which could be made to try and achieve a pass. Do you see that there? And there are 6 listed.
Yes.
And one of the things he says there at 5 is adopt modified K15 solstice, refer discussions in meeting. Do you see that? And then he says, as soon as this is made, if I can get samples for O2 index and calorimetry of any variants of the solstice board, we should try and get them to X over quickly to see if there's any difference in initial flammability calorific output. Do you see that there?
Yes, yes.
Now, can you help us as to what previous discussions he's referring to there about K15 solstice?
No, it must have been one of the options looked at for improved performance in this test, I assume.
And what is K15 solstice?
I think we were looking at a blowing agent in those days, and the hope was that that would become the blowing agent, I think, for K15 in the future.
Yeah.
And that was called Solstice. It was a new generation blowing agent. It was, I can't remember exactly, but hydrofluoroolefin, I think, so
Yeah.
which meant it was unstable in the atmosphere and would break down quite quickly.
Yeah.
But the advantage was it gave an improved lambda value, improved installation value, and also I believe it was slightly less flammable as well.
Yeah. So it had better environmental credentials in terms of its ozone depletion.
No, they were no better. The HFCs and HCFCs were phased out because they had ozone depletion potential.
Yeah.
So anything introduced after that, including IPC, pentanes, didn't have any ozone depletion potential.
And it was a liquid blowing agent, is that right?
Yes, these were fluorinated hydrocarbons that were engineered so they didn't have an ozone depletion potential.
Yeah. And so it's right, isn't it, that Mr. Meredith was proposing that Kingspan use solstice blown K15 in the next test to 8414. But first he wanted to test samples of that at Exova, is that right?
That seems to be what he's discussing, yeah.
And then if we move up the chain on page 1, you respond as follows. In the middle of that page. So in that evening, 21-29, you say, either agree with all except move to solstice as rest are merely tweaks to the test. Suggest any recipient calls me back to discuss rather than email correspondence, which will get too complicated. Regards, Malcolm. Do you see that there?
Yes.
And is it right that you did not agree with the move to solstice blown K15?
I think for this test, I was keen to try and get something that was the same as the product that was on the market, which would have been the presumably the one that was tested. And the move to solstice, well, there were a number of implications. One, it wouldn't have been the product on the market, and which meant that we'd have to introduce a completely new product then.
Yes.
Solstice blown, and it was very early days, if I remember correctly, with our investigations into solstice. So I don't think I was certain that it would be viable. You might test something that actually you can't commercially supply.
Yeah. Why did you want a call back rather than a discussion over email correspondence?
Well, it's obviously Ivor's put a number of possibilities, including solstice. So it was well, let's talk about what is possible and what isn't possible. And the trouble is these email chains go on and on forever. And
yeah. If we move up the chain towards the top of page 1, there are 2 emails between Mr. Millichap and Mr. Meredith into which you're not copied, just to be clear.
Yeah.
And the first is from Mr. Millichap to Ivor Meredith, and he says, Malcolm's response was cryptic. Let me know his thoughts over the solstice element. And then at the top of the email chain, Mr. Meredith responds, will do. He's in meetings today. Also, I edited your comments as I thought he would be concerned over us putting too much in black and white. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Now, were you concerned about putting too much in black and white on this issue?
I don't know what he was referring to in terms of the comments. Edited your comments. I have no idea what those comments were, and we can't see them, so I don't know.
Can I just show you a passage in Mr. Meredith's oral evidence now at day 76, page 122, picking it up at line 4. So at line 4, I say, OK, and did you ever get a clearer picture as to why he didn't want to discuss this in email correspondence? He says it will get too complicated there, but did you ever become aware that there was another reason for? And then he said, Malcolm was always very reserved about what we put in writing. I think I was told off a few times for maybe too illustrative in emails, really. And then I ask, why was he more reserved about what you put in writing? And then he says he'd been through a large legal case with Rochefort, I think. Yes, and he knew how these things could potentially be taken out of context and come back to bite you, basically. And then the question, was that when there was an action by Kingspan against Rochefort in relation to how it represented its products? Yeah, that was the case, yeah. He'd been through that, yeah. And he was, worried about committing things to email. And then he says, I think that might be what he's referring to here, yeah. Do you see that there?
Yes.
And then if we just go over the page to the next page. If we go above this, I ask him about the Tony Miller chap. And then I say, so does that go back to, and then he says, that verifies what I was saying before, yeah. Yes, that you were aware that Malcolm Rochefort didn't like you putting too much in writing about this. And then we've got witness nods. Because he was nervous about this, about if this ever came out. Yes, potentially, yes. Yes, I agree. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Now, is that right that you'd been through the experience of being involved in the case, a civil case, Kingspan against Rochefort?
I'd been in that, and I'd been in a case in the States as well.
And had that made you nervous about committing matters in writing?
I think what he says there is correct. I was a bit nervous about what you put down in emails, but it was, on this particular occasion, I wasn't sure what they could have said that would have been, would have given me problems. It was more a question of, let's get to the bottom of this particular issue that we're talking about, which was the testing regime.
Was one of the reasons you were nervous because that email chain was illustrating that K15 had not yet passed an 8414 Part 2 test, and you were looking at research and development products to try and pass?
I was looking at research and development products to try and pass. That's correct. That's one of the things we were doing was definitely that. But that wouldn't have been why I was nervous about it on that particular occasion. No.
If we can go back to Kingspan's spreadsheet now at KIN 3022357. And I want to look at the next test to 8414 Part 2. This is in the middle of page 3. This was on the 19th of March 2014. And it would appear that this test was not classified to BR135. Do you remember that?
Vaguely, yes.
And in this instance, Kingspan have confirmed, where in that column, the 6th column along, properties of the tested insulation product, that this test was not carried out on the K15, which was being sold, but on a trial product. Do you see that?
Yes.
And the properties of that tested insulation are listed as thickness 80 millimetres, foil unperforated, 50 micron or 100 micron foil. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Whereas the standard K15 had a 25 micron foil facer, didn't it?
That's correct, yes.
And it also says core R330UF1 calcium carbonate and polyol blend added alternative blowing agent. Do you see that there?
Yes.
And was that the Solstice alternative blowing agent?
I assume it was. That's what was being looked at the time, so I assume it was a blend of Solstice of some sort.
Yeah. And presumably the fact that the K15 foam used in that test was made using a different blowing agent was not a surprise to you, given the correspondence you'd had with Mr. Meredith about that very
correct.
matter.
The fact that they were looking at that. I mean, it was a logical thing to do, to look at different formulations that might give you a different result in a system test.
This test is not mentioned in your witness statement. Can you help us as to why that is?
Was I even? I don't know why it isn't mentioned, but I don't know that I was particularly aware of this. I knew that there had been some tests. Did I mention the January one as well? I can't remember.
We'll check that.
Yeah. I mean, I'm writing this witness statement 5 years after I've left the company, so
Yeah,
I'm relying on looking through a load of old documents.
Let's look at some correspondence after the test. KIN 3021907. And if we can scroll to the email at the bottom of the chain, second email on page 3, we can see on the 25th of March, Stephen Howard of the BRE is informing Mr. Meredith in respect of the test. And he says there, in the first line, I discussed the test with Phil and the current status is that you do not have a clear pass. Do you see that there?
Yes.
And then on the same day, Mr. Meredith forwards that message to you, Tony Millichap, and a number of others. That's the bottom of page 2, top of page 3. Right at the bottom there.
Yep.
And then going up then to Mr. Meredith's email at the top of page 2 on the 31st of March 2013 at 13:23, he says this. He says, initial feedback from the BRE is that this test did not meet the requirements of BR 135 third edition. This is by no means the end of this, as we'll be challenging this opinion and doing everything possible to get something usable out of the testing, whether this be an assessment for a different cladding or a shorter build. Do you see that there?
Yes. Yeah.
The test, he says in the next paragraph, is being dismantled this week, so hopefully we can demonstrate very little flame spread on the K15, and this will support the counter-argument that we are preparing.
Yes.
Then he says, as mentioned, we've got a meeting with Tenos, Arup, IFC, Trespa plan to analyse what we've learnt so far in the next paragraph. And then he says this, I spoke to Malcolm on Friday about this and he advised we should proceed with the non-combustible terracotta cladding. Following this news from the BRE, are we all still in agreement in respect of this? Do you see that there?
Yes.
And do you remember speaking to him about saying, well, let's do the terracotta cladding next?
I don't remember speaking to him, but on the other hand, this is quite a credible, it's a credible statement.
Yes.
It would have been the way I was thinking. In other words, if the Trespa was a narrow failure,
yeah,
then the logical thing was to look at the
terracotta.
The terracotta cladding.
Yeah, which is what we see you end up doing, and then in July, in the third test in 2014, which we'll come to, that's the terracotta test. And then he says, I shall know by the end of the week when I will need the insulation for the next test by. However, the question remains about the insulation we choose to use. Is it possible to share the calorimeter results of the solstice versus standard versus phosphoric that we performed at FTT last week? Do you see that there?
Yeah.
Does this support our views on the flammability and calorific content of the different phenolic foams? This would be good to look at alongside the video. Do you see that there?
Yes.
And at this point, do you agree that you are one of the people who are directing the testing strategy? You're discussing with Mr. Meredith what you should test next, having had this fail?
Yeah, I think at this stage we're all looking at what we should be testing.
And did you understand the basis on which the result of this test was going to be challenged?
I assume, I don't understand it. I cannot now recall what the detail was, but I assume from the earlier comments that Ivor had made, this was the one that narrowly failed. So I don't know exactly what was going to be challenged.
And did you know what he meant by doing everything possible to get something usable out of the test? That's the second line, first paragraph.
Yes, I don't know what exactly he meant from that, no.
Are you aware that the test data from this test was used, despite the fact that the tested system wasn't classified to BR135? It was used in a number of desktop assessments for systems incorporating K15. Were you aware of that?
I don't think I was aware of that, no. Presumably, it wasn't claimed that it passed the BR135, was it?
Well, there was a dispute between Kingspan and the BRE about whether it had passed, and a complaint was lodged about it. If we go up the chain a little further up on page 1, at the bottom half of the page, there's an email from Gwyn Davis sent on the 31st of March 2014 at 13:45 46, he starts off saying, surely we risk making fools of ourselves trying to quarrel with them based on an earlier edition of the BR 135. I feel we need to understand why they are terming this a fail and how they've come to this decision, and then discuss internally the counter to this and meet with Phil and Stephen. Do you remember that what Kingspan were trying to say is, well, because the old BR 135 standard didn't make it clear that the full 60-minute test duration was relevant to the pass-fail, that somehow you could go back to that old standard?
I think, now you mention it, I think that does sound familiar, yes.
Yeah. And then at the top of this chain, Tony Millichap says this, same day, 1401. He says, let's not forget, we are carefully pushing for BRE for the result. Typically, this is not issued without the full report after 4 to 5 weeks. In the short term, we are just trying to understand our options whilst waiting for the full data and trying to sow some seeds to influence that result. What did you understand him to mean by that? Sow some seeds to influence that result?
Sorry, I've just missed that.
Sorry,
where
it's
exactly what it said. Oh yes, I've got it in the first paragraph.
Second line, first paragraph, and into the third line. Do you remember being aware of him saying that?
I assume it's one of the bits of information he wants to use to the BRE in trying to convince them that it would be appropriate to issue a BR 135 on it.
Yeah. He then goes on in that same paragraph, in the last sentence, to say this: in the event we do not get what we aimed for, stronger tactics will be employed. Do you see that there?
Yes.
What did you understand him to mean by that? Stronger tactics will be employed.
Well, I think he goes on to say, I will concurrently employ our solicitor to ensure they're fully briefed to support a challenge or defend against any ongoing contracts.
So those are the stronger tactics.
I assume that's what he means, yeah.
To get lawyers involved and defend.
Yes.
I see. Did you consider that to be an acceptable response to the BRE at the time?
I assume that Ivor and Tony felt aggrieved that they had performed a test which, on the older version of the BR 135, would have passed, and that because the BR 135 had been reissued, had now failed, so they felt aggrieved at that, and they were looking at ways in which that could be challenged. It's understandable why they would be doing it.
Yeah. Did you ever object to that at the time?
I didn't, no.
Was there any discussion in early 2014 and following these tests in January and March about the risk to public safety in promoting K15 for use over 18 metres? Were you ever involved in such discussions?
No, not with public safety. Again, at this point, my assumption is still that the LABC and BBA certification is...
Can we go now to KIN 403862? This is an email from you to Mr. Millichap. It's from you to Peter Wilson, Mr. Meredith, Mr. Millichap. Do you see that there? On the 28th of April.
Yes. Yes, I think I'm framing a letter to send to Wintec because we'd said we'd be doing something in 6 months, and it was to say, well, look, we basically we have done something. I don't think it's claiming that...
Yes, well, let's look at what you say. So you say, Dear Paul, so this appears to be a draft email back to Wintec, as you've said. It's been a while since we communicated, and I thought I should give you a quick update. Further to our meeting last October, we have been conducting some further testing with the BRE on BS 8414 Part 2 using Cooltherm K15. As you're probably aware, tests take quite a long time to set up and complete with the BRE, partly because they appear to be quite busy with large-scale fire testing at the moment. And then you say this: the test we recently conducted incorporating a Trespa 18mm cladding system met the criteria for approval under BR 135 Annex B, particularly with respect to the B2 requirement, where the level 2 thermocouples did not exceed 600 degrees within 15 minutes of the start time, and the test was run to completion. we're currently in discussion with the BRE and have had further testing planned. Now, that must be a reference to the test carried out on the 19th of March 2014, is that right?
I think it must be, yes.
It can't be the January 14 test, because that was an 8mm Tresper panel.
I don't think it is.
Now, you knew by the 28th of April 2014, didn't you, that the BRE had confirmed there was no clear pass. That's right, isn't it?
I don't know that I did know that, actually.
Well, you knew that from the email chain we've just looked at from the 31st of March 2014, where Stephen Howard told Kingspan they do not have a clear pass. Do you remember that was forwarded to you?
Yes, I know. I understand that, but I also understood that Tony was challenging that, so that was the situation as far as I was concerned. And, okay, we could argue with the reasons he's challenging it. He's using an old BR-135. But it seemed to me he did have some justification for challenging it. And I think what I was doing here was updating Wintec, really saying, look, we're not doing nothing, we're still working on it. And this is the situation. And I do say we're currently in discussion with BRE and have further testing planned and in active construction. That's also correct.
Yes, but you've said you knew that it was being challenged. In those circumstances, how did you come to write the words at the beginning of that second paragraph? The cladding system met the criteria for approval under BR-135. You knew that wasn't the position the BRE had taken, didn't you?
Obviously, that wording comes from... someone suggested that wording to me, but it would have been based on the earlier BR-135 standard, I assume. Incidentally, this is just a draft email, and I don't even know it was ever sent, was it?
Well, that may be the case, but I just want to ask you, when you drafted this, why you put in the words met the criteria for approval under BR-135 when you knew that there was a dispute going on and that the BRE's position was that it was a fail?
Well, I think that was our position, that it had met the criteria. As you can see, Tony was even considering a legal challenge on it. So that was our position, that it had met the criteria.
So why didn't you say that to Wintec? Why didn't you say, we've just done a test, it was close, we're challenging the results, the BRE don't think it's a pass, but we're challenging that. Why not say that? That was the accurate position, wasn't it?
I think that could have done. It wasn't. I was running this past a number of people and asking for advice on how it would be worded.
I see. And you can't help us as to whether this email was actually sent?
I don't know if it was ever sent.
Okay. Moving on then to the July 2014 test. If we can go back to that spreadsheet, KIN 3022357, in the last row on page 3, we can see it tells us 7th of July 2014, Kingspan Insulation Limited, and then we can see it was a terracotta tile, do you see, under system tested?
Yes.
In the third column, and we can see it was a pass this time. Do you see that there?
Yes.
And then we can see in the 6th column, properties of the tested insulation product. It says trial product, thickness 80 millimetres, foil perforated and unperforated 50 micron.
Yes.
And then if we go over the page, 50 micron foil, and then the core, we've got the same description of the core as with the March test, including alternative blowing agent. Do you see that there?
Yes.
And would that have been, again, the solstice blowing agent?
I believe it was a solstice blend, yeah.
Yeah.
I know there was some dispute over whether it was a 50 micron or a 25 micron, because I think Gwyn thought it was a 25 micron, and he was the one supplying the sample, but that I don't know that...
Did you ever get to the bottom of that?
No, I don't think they got to the bottom of it, but presumably by the time this table was produced, Kingspan was convinced that it was a 50 micron, I assume, because they put that in.
Yes, that's back. If we go back to the bottom of the table that we were just reading from, and it says perforated and unperforated.
Yes.
What was your understanding about whether or not it was a perforated or unperforated, or indeed whether on one side it was perforated, on the other it was not?
Well, I
Do you
think
recall?
I don't know. I never saw the samples, but at some stage we were producing a K15 product that was perforated on one side and unperforated on the other side. So I do know that had been done in the past.
Yeah. But again, this was a trial product, and I think you tell us that in your witness statement. If we look at paragraph 11.23 of your statement on page 50.
Yep. Yes.
11.23, you say you became aware of some discussion, and you say in the third line down on the right-hand side, I had been under the impression that the successful Part 2 test had been conducted on a development K15 product using a 50 micron facer. Yes?
That's correct.
So it was a development trial product, yes?
Yes.
And it wasn't the product that was being sold, therefore?
No.
If we then go to some emails in November 2014, if we could go to KIN 30219004 and look at the top of page 1. I think that's where we're seeing where you've got that in your statement. Do you see that there? I was also strongly under the impression that the latest successful Part 2 test used 50 micron facer. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Yes, you discussed this face-to-face with Gwyn in the office, and we also discussed at the next fire focus group meeting, but limit email conversation. Do you see that there? Why did you say that to Mr. Meredith in this email, but limit email correspondence?
Well, if you look at the
Conversation.
previous couple of pages, I think it is, you've got Ivor saying it was 50 mil, me chipping in, I thought it was 50 mil, Adrian saying he thought it was 50 mil, and Gwyn thought that it was 25 mil, and it seemed to me that was not resolvable on an email ping-pong system. So it was better that Ivor spoke directly to Gwyn, and that's why I'm saying face-to-face, and we don't want any more of this.
I see. Yes.
Carrying on.
And I just want to move now to my final topic, which is about Kingspan's dealing with the NHBC, which is a short topic. You deal with the subject of the NHBC in response to the inquiry's questions in section 10 of your witness statement, which starts on page 42. If we could go to paragraph 10.2 on page 42. You say at the top there, as far as I can recall, Kingspan regarded the NHBC as playing a critical role in the sale of certain insulation products to construction areas. It was seen as critical to ensure that the NHBC was content with Kingspan's products in order to maximise sale of those products into construction areas in which NHBC played a role. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Did that include K15?
I assume it would include K15, yes.
And you go on to say later in your statement that your recollection is that you weren't involved in any meetings with the NHBC. Is that right?
That's my recollection, yeah.
And you've also said over on page 43 of your statement, paragraph 10.4, that you were not involved in any internal meetings about the NHBC and the use of K15. Is that right?
As far as I recall, I was not involved in any meetings relating to K15 and the MBC and the HBC, though I did receive email correspondence from Ivor Meredith regarding a meeting he held with the NHBC in August 2014.
Yeah. If we can just look at an email from August 2014, which I think is what you're referring to there, KIN 30020736. This is an email from Mr. Meredith, 21st of August 2014. We can see the subject is comment required by Monday 5 p.m. please, K15 update. Do you see that there? And the subject.
Oh, yes, it's the heading, is it?
And you're one of the recipients of this email.
Yes.
And he says, in the first paragraph, as the key stakeholders for the current Cooltherm K15 fire certification issues, I've taken 5 to update you all on the current situation since our last meeting. Do you see that there?
Yes.
And so, is that right? Did you regard yourself at the time as one of the key stakeholders for the current Cooltherm K15 fire certification issues?
Yes, I would have been, and I'm just looking at the list. That's probably everyone. There might have been a few others as well, but...
Under that heading, that first heading, NHBC BCA, do you see that there at point 1 of his email?
Yes.
He writes this: a meeting has been held with the NHBC, whom are still pushing for someone to provide a job-specific test data.
Yes.
Provide job-specific test data. They are still sanctioning the use of K15 as long as they get a bespoke letter off Kingspan, which technical projects are turning around in 48 hours on receipt of the drawings and confirmation of the fire barrier dimensions. And then he says they have also given us an extra 3 months to get some further assessments on the test data to meet their needs. And then he says we have also requested 2-week notification if they decide to change their stance. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Did you authorise those bespoke letters which were being turned around in 48 hours at that time?
No, I wouldn't have seen them, and I wouldn't be aware of the detail in those at all.
Who was signing off on those, as far as you understood it?
Let's have a look. As long as they get a bespoke letter of KIL, which technical projects are turning around in receive drawings. Well, if it says bespoke letter, it must be someone in our technical department is providing it with them.
Right.
So it presumably would have been Tony Millichap or Ivor.
Yeah. Did you ever check any of those letters yourself?
I don't think so, no.
Right.
No.
And then if we can look at point 6 at the bottom of page 2 of this email. It's a long email. He writes this. He says, we've issued a couple of standard letters to the larger contractors, Praters, Lakesmere, etc., and confirming our good news, confirming pending reports, and a more general letter confirming test success. These are being used by technical and sales for job-specific queries, which we are targeting handling within 48 hours of receipt. Tony Malcolm, I've not written to Stuart Taylor at Wintec. Has this been done? Do you see that there?
I do, yeah.
Do you know why this was being done, issuing standard letters to the larger contractors, confirming good news, and a more general letter about test success? Do you know why that was being done?
I don't know, but I know there was quite a lot of discussion at the time about introducing the Solstice blowing agent as a new product. So I'm assuming this is about the new version of the product, which would have Solstice blowing agent involved.
Yes, you and Mr. Meredith knew at the time that the July 2014 test had been carried out on a trial product, but that was not on the K15, which was being sold by Kingspan and actually used on projects, was it?
Not at this point, no.
No.
But I think that was tested in April 2015, wasn't it?
But you were the technical director at this time, and you can see that reliance is being placed on that test success, which was on a trial product. Can you explain how you were comfortable with that?
I think that I assumed, maybe wrongly, that they're talking about a new product would be produced based on this blowing agent configuration.
Yes, but you can see that they're sending letters, including technical and sales job-specific query letters, which they're handling within 48 hours of receipt. So they're turning around these letters recommending K15 within 48 hours. How were you comfortable with that when you knew that the only success you'd had at that time was on a trial product and not the K15 you were selling?
Well, again, I think I would have been relying on the fact that the LABC certification was covering us.
Well, by this time, the LABC...
Sorry, had you finished what you wanted to say?
But in this particular case, it doesn't say what these letters are going to contain in them, so I'm not quite sure what they are. I was speculating when I said it might be about the Solstice product. I don't know what these letters were about.
Sorry, I shouldn't have interrupted you, but by this time, the LABC certificate saying that K15 was a limited combustibility product was long expired. So you couldn't be relying on that, could you?
Not if it was expired, I couldn't be, no.
No. So are you saying that you simply weren't aware that K15 was being recommended on projects at that time, and that somehow what was being said here is that you might be recommending a future Solstice-blown product?
That could be what was implied by that paragraph, but I don't know.
Did you ever check?
I don't think I did, no.
Why not? You're the technical director. Why do you not check that you're not selling K15 on the basis of test data that's irrelevant because it's based on a trial product?
I didn't, and maybe that was a mistake, but I would have looked at the whole... I think I would have been looking at this email, rather long email from Ivor, and I would have been highlighting to myself things that were of interest. I would have seen the comment at the bottom, Tony Malcolm, I've not written to Stuart Taylor at Wintec, has this been done? And I probably would have concentrated on that as an action, a potential action for me.
Would you accept that this was deliberate and planned reliance by Kingspan on a test of a trial product to support the use of a completely different product?
I don't think that was the intention, no, because the standard product was tested the following April, and it passed on a terracotta cladding system.
Right. Are you prepared to accept that during the whole of your time as technical director of the company, Kingspan had no test evidence which related to the K15 product actually being sold to market, which could support the use of that product on buildings over 18 metres in height?
I'm not prepared to accept it that that was done knowingly. I think if you look back and you say, well, the old technology was completely different to the new technology, and that was the original test that was based on, you could make an argument for that, but it wasn't done knowingly. And the certification I took in good faith. I assumed that was correct.
I see. Mr. Chairman, I've come to the end of my questions. I'm sorry, I'm slightly over 4:30. If we could have the customary break.
Yes.
I mean, we may have to, at that point, just reserve our position on recalling this witness while we check the notes that he referred to. But I think we have to see where we get to with that. I don't think that should stop us releasing this witness today.
Well, we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves. Let's deal with any questions first.
Yeah.
Now, Dr. Rochefort, when we get to this point, councils think she's finished asking all the questions, but we always have a short break both to allow her to check and to allow those who aren't present in the room but are following these hearings to suggest other questions that perhaps should be put to you. So we're going to break now until 4:45.
Okay.
And then we'll see whether there are any more questions that we need to ask you. Is that all right?
Yes.
And please don't talk to anyone about your evidence while you're out. Thank you. Right, 4:45, please. Would you ask Dr. Rochefort to come back in, please? Right, Dr. Rochefort, we'll see if there are any more questions for you. Ms. Grange, do you have questions?
Yes, just a couple. The METSEC tests that were done back in 2008 that we were discussing with
Right.
K15, the failures, when we were discussing what conclusions you formed about the performance of K15, was it a factor in your thinking at the time that there'd also been a METSEC test with rock wool which had failed to BS 8414?
I think it was a factor, but it would have been one of several things.
Can you explain how that was relevant, how you thought that was a factor?
I think what it would have shown was that the system, even with a non-combustible insulant, also failed.
Were you ever aware that there was also a pass with a METSEC rock wool system in 2008?
No, I wasn't, but I wouldn't necessarily have been aware of that.
Were you aware that Mr. Meredith was present at the METSEC rock wool fail in 2008, one of those tests?
I didn't know that he was necessarily present, but I know Ivor spent quite a lot of time down at Garston, so it's possible.
We've gone through quite a lot in the last day, well, today, Dr. Rochefort. If you had your time again, what would you do differently?
I would probably ask more questions. That would be my biggest regret about it, I think.
Yes.
Right.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, there's just the remaining matter of the recent disclosure.
Yes.
Just to be clear, that we've checked, and it would appear that together with a lot of other information we've had from Kingspan, very late, we have been inundated with late disclosure from Kingspan. On the 17th of November, those notes were provided, although it wasn't clearly marked that these were Dr. Rochefort's notes.
Right.
We're obviously in your hands as to what you do. I think some teams would like him not to be released. That's Team 2's position of the BSRs until they've had a chance to consider that.
Have you or those who sit behind you had a chance to look at those notes?
We've had a brief look, and
Did
we
they
can't see
contain
anything
of any?
We can't see anything terribly significant at the moment in terms of changing the evidence or in terms of questions we'd want to put. But what we could do is let Dr. Rochefort go today, and then if there are further questions to put to him, once everybody's seen those documents, we can then, if necessary, recall him or put those further questions to him in another way.
All right. Thank you very much. Well, Dr. Rochefort, those are all the questions we have for you. And I think the first thing for me to say is to thank you very much for coming to give your evidence. It's been a long day for you. I'm sorry it's taken longer than we thought, but we're very grateful, and it's been very helpful to hear from you. Now, about your diary,
Yes,
you've got it somewhere safe at home, I take it.
I have. Although it has been scanned, all the relevant sections.
Yes, but it's nice to know where the original
Oh,
is.
no, it's...
I'm going to ask you to look after it carefully. Now, what we're going to do about that, as you've heard, it has been disclosed to us. Council have had a look at it. They are satisfied that it does not contain anything that will assist us or will give rise to any further questions. But as you know, there are other people who are interested in this inquiry, and they've not yet had a chance to look at it.
Yes.
So what I'm going to say is that although I'm going to release you now, which means you obviously not just that you go home, but you're free to talk about the inquiry if you want to, I would ask you please not to talk to people about your contents of your diary.
Right.
And I think if it transpires that there are further questions arising out of the diary when we've had a better chance to look at it, or if other people suggest questions that ought to be asked when they've had a chance to look at it, it might be necessary to ask you to come back and deal with those questions.
I understand that, yes.
And we'll let you know in good time if that turns out to be the case.
I should say there's quite a bit of personal information in those diaries.
Well, we shan't be troubling you with that.
Hopefully not. No.
But for the time being, thank you very much for coming, and you're free to go.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good. Well, that must be the end for today.
It is, Mr.
And
Chairman.
we'll have another witness tomorrow.
We have another Kingspan witness tomorrow, Mr. Tony Millichap.
Right, thank you. So we'll rise now and we'll resume at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. Thank you very much.